Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast. Today, we're going to be diving into something pretty fascinating. It's an often overlooked aspect of World War II,
Yeah.
desertion in Hitler's Wehrmacht.
It's one of those topics that really makes you question those assumptions that we have about the German military at the time.
Right. And you think about this, just the sheer scale of the war,
Yeah.
the atrocities, and it's easy to just imagine this kind of like monolithic force blindly following orders, but then you learn that the German military actually executed somewhere between 18,000 and 22,000
Wow.
of their own soldiers for desertion.
That's a staggering number.
It is. More than almost any other army in modern history. So that really makes you stop and think.
Absolutely. It really suggests a level of dissent and resistance that we don't often hear about,
Right.
in that broader narrative. So to really understand this phenomenon, I think we need to dig into the historical context a little bit, starting with the legacy of World War I.
Okay, yeah. No, it's a great point. The book Hitler's Deserters by Douglas Carl Peifer, which is our main source for this deep dive today, really emphasizes that connection.
It does. And Peifer, he argues that the stab in the back myth,
Right.
that false belief that the German army was never actually defeated in the field, but betrayed by civilians back home,
Yeah.
that had a huge impact on the military's mindset going into World War II.
So are you saying that this myth basically created this climate of fear and suspicion within the Wehrmacht
Yeah.
that made soldiers hesitant to speak out or even question orders, even if they had these moral conflicts?
Exactly. And of course, you have figures like Ludendorff and Hitler who exploited this sentiment to the fullest.
Right.
They used it to justify that brutal suppression of any perceived weakness or disloyalty.
It's unsettling how that ideology really seeped into the legal system as well. Pfeiffer's book, it goes into the German military penal code during World War II and really lays out that legal landscape surrounding desertion.
One of the things that Peifer points out is that while the code itself might seem on the surface, fairly standard, in its definitions of desertion versus unauthorized absence,
Yeah.
in practice, it was a tool for enforcing ideological conformity.
So unpack that a little for me. How are those terms defined differently?
Well, unauthorized absence, that could be a lot of things, like
Yeah.
overstaying leave, getting separated from your unit,
Or,
things
yeah.
like that.
Right.
Desertion implied intent to permanently evade service.
So how did authorities determine intent? Were there specific criteria that they looked for?
It wasn't always clear-cut. They would scrutinize every detail. Did the soldier discard his uniform,
Oh, wow.
his weapon? Did he try to cross into neutral territory,
Yeah.
resist arrest? All of these were seen as indications of an intention to desert permanently.
So even if the law itself wasn't inherently like barbaric or anything,
Right.
it sounds like its application was incredibly subjective and open to manipulation.
Absolutely. And that's something that's really crucial to keep in mind, I think, as we examine these cases.
Right.
We have to remember that context, the atmosphere of fear and paranoia that permeated the whole system.
It really challenges that myth of the clean Wehrmacht, doesn't it?
It does. When you examine the Wehrmacht's role in the Holocaust, the brutal treatment of Soviet POWs, it becomes very clear that they were complicit
Yeah.
in the horrors of the Nazi regime.
Right.
And that ideology, of course, made the punishment for desertion even more severe.
Of course.
Yeah,
Because it was a betrayal of the Führer, the party,
Yeah.
the entire racial community.
exactly.
Before we get into some of the individual stories, which I'm really fascinated to hear about,
Yeah.
I want to encourage our listeners to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends.
Yes.
You can also join the Allison Knows community on Spotify and YouTube.
Yeah.
Now, you've uncovered some really compelling stories from Pfeiffer's book. Can you share a few of those with us?
I would love to. Peifer does such a great job of really bringing these deserters to life.
Yeah.
And their stories, they reveal a different facet of what that human experience was like under Nazi rule.
Okay.
So let's start with Wilhelm Hanno.
Okay, what's his story?
Well, Hanno managed to hide at home for 2 years with the help of his wife.
Wow.
Can you imagine the courage and the loyalty?
It's incredible.
It's amazing, and it really speaks to the risks that families were willing to take
Right.
to protect their loved ones.
His story really makes you think about the ripple effects,
Mm-hmm.
of those decisions, how desertion wasn't just about that individual soldier,
Right.
but it impacted entire families.
Exactly. It highlights the fact that resistance took many forms, even those acts of quiet defiance, like just hiding someone from the authorities. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
Did Peifer highlight any cases where maybe a soldier's personal identity just clashed with the demands of the regime?
Yes, absolutely. Take Stefan Hampel, for instance, a soldier of mixed German-Polish heritage.
Uh,
He struggled with that Nazi racial ideology, which ultimately led him to desert.
That's such a powerful example of how, like, personal identity could just create this profound conflict
Yeah.
for individuals caught in this machinery of the Nazi state.
It reminds us that not everyone fit neatly into the Nazis' narrow worldview.
Right.
And for some, that dissonance became just unbearable.
Peifer also discusses cases of conscientious objectors.
He does, yeah.
Doesn't he?
Yes. Jacob Bugg, for example, was a Jehovah's Witness who refused to serve for religious reasons. He represents a small but incredibly courageous group of people
Right.
who stood by their convictions even in the face of, potential persecution and execution.
It makes you wonder how many other acts of just quiet resistance
I know.
went unnoticed during the war.
It challenges our understanding of what even constitutes defiance
It really does.
in a totalitarian regime.
It also underscores the fact that the Nazis' control, while formidable, was never absolute.
Right.
There were always cracks in the facade, individuals who found ways to resist.
What about those who witnessed the regime's atrocities firsthand?
Yes.
Did their experiences influence their decisions to desert it all? Absolutely. Ludwig Metz, for instance, was a soldier who served on the Eastern Front and was deeply disturbed by the mass killings of Jews and other civilians
Right.
that he witnessed. These atrocities ultimately led him to question his loyalty and choose desertion.
Makes me think about the psychological toll of war,
Mm-hmm.
especially a war like this one, where the lines between right and wrong were just so deliberately blurred. How do you even make sense of what you're seeing?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile those actions with your conscience?
That's a profound question, and it's one that I think many soldiers grappled with. For some, the experience of witnessing these horrors was a breaking point,
Yeah.
a moment of moral reckoning that led them to reject the entire system.
It's clear from these stories that desertion wasn't just a physical act.
It wasn't.
It took many forms, driven by a variety of motivations.
Precisely. And sometimes those motivations were far more complex and disturbing. Take Willie Harold, for instance.
Okay, what makes his case different?
Harold was a young paratrooper who exploited the chaos of the war's final days for his own personal gain.
Oh, wow.
And actually committed terrible acts of violence, using stolen authority to execute prisoners and civilians.
Wow. His story's so chilling. It's a stark contrast to the others we've discussed so far.
It is.
It makes you realize that desperation and opportunity can bring out the worst in people,
Yeah.
even in those who might have started out with good intentions.
It's a reminder that war creates a moral quagmire,
Right.
where the lines between victim and perpetrator can become tragically blurred.
What about those who tried to escape to neutral territories?
Mm-hmm.
What were their experiences like?
Well, Switzerland and Sweden were the primary destinations for German deserters
Okay.
seeking neutral ground. But even reaching those countries was so dangerous. Imagine trying to cross borders undetected, evading patrols, constantly looking over your shoulder. It must have been terrifying.
It sounds terrifying, and even if they made it, things weren't necessarily easy, were they?
Not at all. Switzerland, for example, had these really complex internment policies.
Okay.
Some deserters faced really harsh conditions and suspicion even after reaching safety.
It's almost like they couldn't escape the shadow of the war,
Yeah.
even in a neutral country.
It makes you wonder if they were ever truly free from that burden
Right.
of their choices.
And what about those who tried to cross enemy lines? What were their motivations for that?
It was really a mixed bag, Some were driven by personal struggles,
Okay.
a feeling of alienation within the military. Others were deeply troubled by what they had witnessed
Yeah.
and wanted to actively fight against the Nazi regime.
So it wasn't always a black and white decision.
No,
Did the Allied powers play any role in encouraging desertion?
absolutely. They engaged in extensive propaganda campaigns,
Okay.
dropping leaflets, making radio broadcasts, promising good treatment to German soldiers who surrendered.
Wow. So desertion became like this part of the psychological warfare
It did?
of the time?
Yeah, it's fascinating how something that seems so individual, like
Wow.
desertion, actually played such a multifaceted role in the larger conflict.
It touches on themes of individual conscience, military discipline, ideological struggle, psychological warfare. It's
Yeah.
really Pretty remarkable.
It really is. And this complexity carries over into the post-war period as well.
Right.
The figure of the deserter played a big role in shaping post-war German consciousness.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
It does.
How was desertion viewed in post-war Germany? Was it seen as an act of cowardice or a form of resistance?
Well, that's a question that sparked a lot of debate and continues to be relevant even today.
Before we dive into that, I want to take a moment to remind our listeners to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. It really helps get the word out about these important topics. Also, make sure to join the Allison Knows community on Spotify and YouTube for more deep dives like this.
Oh, I love hearing from you guys.
Now, back to post-war Germany. How did they grapple with the legacy of these deserters?
Well, the two Germanys, obviously separated by ideology and circumstance, had very different approaches to dealing with the legacy of desertion. West Germany had a much more open and kind of multifaceted discussion.
So they acknowledged that there were different motivations behind desertion.
Right.
It wasn't always just cowardice or betrayal.
Exactly. There was a recognition that some deserters had acted out of genuine moral conviction,
Okay.
while others were driven by more personal motivations, which led to these complex debates
Right.
about how to judge these individuals.
So were there attempts to rehabilitate those who'd been convicted?
Yes, there were. However, there was also pushback, particularly from veterans groups and conservative circles who still viewed desertion as a grave offense. It became kind of this proxy for a larger societal struggle,
Yeah.
a way of working through the guilt and the trauma of the Nazi past.
Peifer mentions a writer, Alfred Anders,
Yes.
who deserted from the Wehrmacht and later wrote about his experiences.
Right.
Did his work play a role in this debate at all?
Absolutely. Anders's memoir, The Cherries of Freedom, it presented desertion as an act of liberation,
Wow.
a conscious rejection of the Nazi regime and its ideology. He framed it as a reclaiming of individual freedom and moral responsibility.
That's a powerful way of looking at it.
It is.
It challenges that traditional narrative of the deserter as a coward or a traitor. Did his book have an impact on public opinion?
It definitely sparked controversy.
Okay.
Some praised Anders for his honesty and courage, while others condemned him as a traitor.
Yeah.
But, his story really touched a nerve.
Yeah.
Highlighting the deep divisions that still existed within West German society about how to interpret the past and how to judge those who had lived through it.
It sounds like the issue of desertion really forced West Germans to confront some uncomfortable truths about themselves and their history.
It did, and it wasn't just Anders. Other writers and filmmakers explored those themes as well.
Right.
It was a complex and often emotional debate, reflecting that ongoing struggle to define a new moral and political compass for post-war Germany.
What about East Germany? How did they approach this issue?
Well, as you might imagine, the communist regime in East Germany had a very different agenda.
Yeah.
They weren't interested in promoting individual acts of defiance against the Nazi regime.
Okay.
Their focus was on presenting a unified front of communist resistance led by the party.
So how did they deal with the fact that there were undoubtedly Wehrmacht deserters living in East Germany?
Initially, they were largely ignored or marginalized. Their stories didn't fit the official narrative.
So the regime preferred to focus on those heroic sacrifices of communist partisans.
Right.
Red Army soldiers.
Exactly.
But that eventually changed, didn't it? Peifer mentions that East Germany began to rehabilitate certain deserters later on.
Yeah, that's right. As the Cold War intensified, East Germany began to use Wehrmacht deserters, particularly those who had joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, or the BDO, for propaganda purposes.
I'm not familiar with those organizations. Can you tell us a little bit more about them?
Sure. So the National Committee for a Free Germany, or NKFD, was an anti-Nazi organization founded in the Soviet Union in 1943. And it was composed of German communists, prisoners of war, and some Wehrmacht deserters. The BDO, or Bund Deutscher Offiziere, was a similar organization.
Got it.
Specifically for German officers who had turned against the Nazi regime.
So East Germany essentially co-opted these deserters.
Yeah.
Using them to bolster their own ideological agenda.
Exactly. They presented them as evidence that even within the Wehrmacht, there were individuals who recognized the evils of Nazism and chose to side with the Soviet Union. It was a way of legitimizing their own regime, demonstrating their anti-fascist credentials.
It's fascinating how both East and West Germany
It is.
Despite their ideological differences, kind of both use the legacy of desertion
Yeah.
for their own political purposes.
It really highlights how history can be manipulated and reinterpreted to serve different agendas, right? And it reminds us to be critical of those official narratives
Yeah.
and seek out multiple perspectives.
Before we move on, I want to encourage our listeners to share their thoughts and reactions to what we've discussed so far. You can leave comments on our social media platforms or join the Allison Knows community on Spotify and YouTube. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, if you're enjoying this deep dive, please like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends.
Yes, please do.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the actual process of desertion. What did it look like in practice? What were the risks involved?
You know, desertion was never a simple act. It required careful planning, courage, and often a good dose of luck. You know, remember, we're talking about soldiers operating within a highly disciplined and authoritarian system.
So they couldn't just walk away from their units whenever they felt like it.
No, not at all. There were severe penalties for even minor infractions, let alone something as serious as desertion. Soldiers who wanted to desert had to find ways to slip away unnoticed, often at night or during those chaotic moments in battle.
What about their weapons and uniforms?
Yeah.
Wouldn't those give them away?
Yes, absolutely. Discarding a uniform or weapon was seen as a clear sign of an intention to desert permanently. So deserters had to find ways to conceal these items or dispose of them discreetly.
So where did they go? What were some of the most common destinations for deserters?
Well, some tried to return home,
Right.
hoping to just blend back into civilian life. Others sought refuge in forests or remote areas.
To avoid detection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Some even attempted to cross borders into neutral countries, though, as we discussed, that was incredibly risky.
Yeah. What were the chances of success? Did many deserters manage to evade capture?
The odds were definitely stacked against them.
Yeah.
The Nazi regime had a vast network of informants and was incredibly efficient at tracking down deserters.
So even if you managed to escape your unit, you were still living under a cloud of fear and suspicion.
Absolutely. The threat of capture was always present, and the consequences, if caught, were severe.
What kind of punishments did deserters face?
It varied depending on the circumstances,
Okay.
but the penalties could range from imprisonment to hard labor to execution.
Wow.
And it wasn't just the deserters themselves who were punished. Their families could also face reprisals,
Oh, gosh.
including harassment, imprisonment, or even deportation to concentration camps.
It's just horrifying.
It is.
It really highlights that brutality of the Nazi regime.
It does.
They weren't content with just punishing the individual. They wanted to make an example of them,
Right.
deter anyone else from even thinking about desertion.
Exactly. Fear was a very powerful tool of control, and the Nazis wielded it masterfully. They wanted to create an atmosphere where dissent was unthinkable.
Where obedience was the only option.
Exactly.
Were there any instances of leniency? Did all deserters face these harsh punishments?
You know, in the early years of the war, when the regime was more confident and the military situation was more favorable,
Okay.
there were some cases of deserters being returned to their units with relatively minor punishments.
Okay.
But as the war dragged on and things got more desperate,
Right.
the regime's tolerance for dissent just evaporated.
So the longer the war went on, the more dangerous it became to desert.
Absolutely. The regime saw desertion as a direct threat to its ability to wage war, and they cracked down accordingly.
Peifer also talks about the role of military tribunals in dealing with deserters. What were those like?
Military tribunals, or flying courts-martial, as they were sometimes called,
Okay.
were essentially kangaroo courts,
Right.
designed to expedite the legal process and deliver swift and brutal justice.
So they were less about due process.
Right.
More about making an example of the accused.
Exactly. Deserters often had little or no chance to defend themselves.
Huh.
You know, these tribunals were tools of the regime, designed to instill fear and maintain discipline. They were a stark reminder of what happened to those who dared to challenge the Nazi system.
It's amazing how the act of desertion, which, might seem like a personal choice,
Yeah.
actually reveals so much about the nature of the Nazi regime and the pressures that individuals faced
Absolutely.
under their rule.
It does. It's a lens through which we can examine, themes of obedience, resistance, ideology,
Yeah.
the human cost of war.
I'm curious to hear more about the experiences of those who managed to evade capture.
Mm-hmm.
What did their lives look like? How did they survive?
Those who successfully escaped capture faced just a ton of challenges. They had to live clandestine lives, constantly on the move, hiding their true identities.
It sounds like an incredibly stressful,
It was.
precarious existence.
It was. Some relied on the kindness of strangers,
Okay.
sympathetic individuals who were willing to risk their own safety to help those fleeing the regime. Others joined underground networks,
Right.
relying on the support and solidarity of fellow resistors.
Did any deserters join the active resistance against the Nazis?
Yes, there were cases of deserters joining partisan groups or engaging in sabotage operations.
Wow.
Their military training and knowledge of the German military made them valuable assets to the resistance.
It's a reminder that resistance took many forms,
It did.
from those individual acts of defiance
Yeah.
to organized efforts to undermine the Nazi regime.
Precisely. And the lines between these different forms of resistance were often blurred.
Right.
Desertion, in many ways, was a gateway to more active forms of opposition. It represented a break with the system, a rejection of its authority.
It's fascinating how something that might seem like a purely individual choice,
Yeah.
the decision to desert, actually had such profound implications
It did.
for the larger struggle against Nazism.
It really underscores the interconnectedness of events,
Yeah.
how individual choices can have a ripple effect, inspiring others and contributing to larger movements for change.
Before we move on to the post-war period, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible courage and resilience of these deserters. They faced unimaginable pressure and risked everything to follow their consciences. Their stories deserve to be remembered and honored.
Absolutely. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, human beings are capable of extraordinary acts of courage and compassion.
And for our listeners, if you're finding this conversation as thought-provoking as I am, please consider supporting the show by liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends. You can also join the Allison Knows community on Spotify and YouTube for more deep dives like this. We really appreciate your support.
So now that we've kind of explored the motivations and challenges of desertion during the war, let's talk about the post-war period. It seems like the figure of the deserter really became this powerful symbol in post-war German consciousness. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's fascinating how both East and West Germany grappled with this legacy of desertion, but in very different ways, reflecting their own ideologies and political agendas. Let's start with West Germany. We talked about Alfred Anders and his controversial memoir a bit earlier. How did his work and the broader discussion of desertion really shape West German society?
Well, Anders' The Cherries of Freedom, it sparked this crucial debate about individual responsibility versus the demands of the state,
Yeah?
especially under a totalitarian regime. His framing of desertion as this moral act of liberation resonated with some,
Right.
but outraged those who saw it as a betrayal of duty. It was really divisive.
So it wasn't just about legal definitions anymore. It was a much deeper moral and philosophical reckoning.
Exactly. It became this touchstone for grappling with the guilt and the trauma of the Nazi past. Should deserters be condemned for breaking their oaths or celebrated for having the moral clarity to reject a criminal regime? There were no easy answers.
Right.
And West German society, as it rebuilt itself, really wrestled with these complex questions.
Did this debate lead to any practical implications? Like, were there any changes in how deserters were treated or remembered?
It definitely influenced public discourse and artistic explorations of the war. It prompted some legal efforts to re-examine past convictions and offer pardons to those who deserted for moral reasons.
Okay.
However, this process was controversial and faced resistance from those who held on to that traditional view of desertion as treason. It was complicated.
Yeah, it sounds like a very nuanced and emotionally charged process.
It was.
Did anything similar happen in East Germany?
Well, while West Germany had this more open and introspective examination of desertion, East Germany, under communist rule, took a very different approach.
Right.
Initially, they downplayed any individual act of defiance against the Nazi regime
Okay.
because it didn't really fit their narrative
Yeah.
of a unified communist resistance.
So the stories of these individual Wehrmacht deserters were basically ignored.
Precisely. They didn't align with the official propaganda,
Right.
which emphasized the heroic role of the Communist Party. The focus was on this collective struggle against fascism, not these individual acts of conscience.
But as you mentioned before, that stance kind of shifted as the Cold War gained momentum. How did East Germany start using those stories for their own purposes?
Well, as the Cold War intensified, East Germany saw a propaganda opportunity
Okay.
in rehabilitating certain Wehrmacht deserters, particularly those who had joined communist-aligned groups,
Hmm.
like the National Committee for a Free Germany or the Bund Deutscher Offizier.
So they basically rebranded these deserters as anti-fascist heroes
Yeah,
who saw the light and joined the right side, so to speak.
exactly. By highlighting these select cases,
Right.
they could claim this moral high ground
Yeah.
and paint a picture of widespread opposition to Nazism within the German military, which conveniently aligned with their own communist ideology.
It's a really striking example of how historical narratives
It
can be
is.
manipulated to serve these political agendas.
Yeah, and it shows that the issue of desertion continued to be relevant
Right.
and contested long after the war had ended.
It's clear that the story of desertion in Hitler's Wehrmacht is far more complex and nuanced than it might seem at first glance. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about the German military during World War II and consider the extraordinary moral dilemmas faced by individuals caught in the machinery of a totalitarian regime.
I agree. It really compels us to ask ourselves, what would we have done in those circumstances? How would we have navigated the pressures of conformity and the pull of conscience?
It also reminds us that history is not just facts and dates,
No,
but it's a tapestry woven from these countless individual stories,
absolutely.
each with its own complexities and contradictions.
Mm.
And it's by exploring those stories
Mm-hmm.
that we can gain a much deeper understanding of the past and how it's relevant to our own lives.
It's through these individual stories that we can truly grasp that human cost of war
Right.
and the enduring power of the human spirit.
I think that's a really powerful message to leave our listeners with. Before we wrap up, I want to encourage everyone to continue exploring this topic. Douglas Carl Peifer's Hitler's Deserters is a great place to start. And there are many other resources available online and in libraries.
Yeah, it's a subject that really deserves our attention and reflection.
And for those who found this deep dive thought-provoking, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends. You can also join the Allison Knows community on Spotify and YouTube for more fascinating conversations like this one.
We appreciate your support, and we look forward to engaging with you guys in future episodes.
Thank you for listening to the Allison Knows podcast. Follow Allison on Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok.